A law student went missing from her apartment without any sign of forced entry. Her personal belongings were still inside. There was no indication that she had left on her own. Nothing in the apartment suggested a struggle. Neighbors reported seeing nothing unusual during that time. As the investigation began, people connected to the situation started speaking publicly about the case. One of them appeared calm, cooperative, and willing to help. He answered questions carefully and described the situation in detail. But some of his responses did not match the circumstances of the disappearance. Those details were not immediately questioned. And the person speaking about the case was not just observing it, he was already part of it. The person at the center of that case was Lauren Giddings, a law student living in an apartment complex in Macon, Georgia. In 2011, she was reported missing from her apartment without any clear indication of how she had left. She was known to follow a consistent routine and remained in regular contact with people around her. Her last confirmed activity placed her inside her apartment during the evening hours. After that point, there were no verified sightings of her leaving the building. When she did not respond to messages or appear as expected, concern began to increase. Friends and neighbors noted that her absence was unusual based on her normal behavior. Her apartment was later checked, and her personal belongings were still inside. There were no clear signs that she had packed or left voluntarily. There was also no obvious indication of forced entry into the apartment. This meant that whoever had last interacted with her likely had direct access or familiarity with the environment. At this stage, the investigation focused on identifying who had contact with her during that window. As the investigation focused on her apartment, the absence of any clear exit raised immediate concern. When access to the apartment was examined, her belongings were still inside and appeared undisturbed. There were no signs that she had left voluntarily or taken anything with her. The lack of forced entry suggested whoever was involved either had access or was allowed inside. As officers expanded their search within the building, a critical discovery was made outside her apartment. Near the property, investigators located physical evidence that indicated the case was no longer a missing person investigation. The nature of that evidence confirmed that a violent crime had occurred rather than a simple disappearance. This shifted the investigation toward determining exactly what had taken place inside the apartment. At that stage, officers began focusing on individuals who lived in close proximity to her. The timeline was now centered not just on when she was last seen, but who had access to her environment. While the initial scene inside the apartment did not show obvious signs of struggle, the broader evidence told a different story. This contrast between what was visible and what had occurred became central to the investigation. The investigation then moved outward from Lauren's apartment to the people living closest to her. One of those people was Stephen McDaniel, her next-door neighbor and former law school classmate. He lived close enough to know her routine, her apartment location, and the layout of the building. At first, he presented himself as cooperative and concerned, speaking like someone watching the case unfold from outside it. But his position in the building made him more than a distant witness. He was close to the last known location, close to the discovery area, and close to the timeline investigators were trying to reconstruct. Police began collecting statements from neighbors, including Stephen, to identify who had seen or heard anything during the critical window. Nothing in his first public behavior openly identified him as the offender, but proximity alone made his account important. Investigators also needed to know whether anyone nearby had access to Lauren's apartment or knowledge of how to enter without force. That question became more important because the apartment did not show clear force entry. The case was now moving from a missing person search into a building-level investigation, where one neighbor's access mattered more than it first appeared. As investigators continued reviewing statements from those in the building, Stephen McDaniel's position became more closely examined. He confirmed that he lived next door and was familiar with Lauren's apartment and daily routine. He also acknowledged being present in the building during the period when she was last known to be inside. At that stage, investigators needed to determine how entry to her apartment had occurred without visible force. The condition of the door and interior ruled out a forced break-in. This meant that access had likely been gained by someone familiar with the building and its layout. Because of his proximity and knowledge of the environment, Stephen's position became more relevant to that question. Investigators also considered how movement within the apartment complex could occur without drawing attention. Surveillance coverage in and around the building was limited, leaving parts of the timeline without independent verification. This meant that statements about location and movement could not be fully confirmed through external evidence. The lack of disturbance inside the apartment remained a critical detail that required explanation. At this stage, the investigation narrowed toward individuals who had both access and familiarity with the environment. As investigators focused on individuals with both proximity to Lauren and familiarity with the building, attention narrowed to those who could have entered without forcing access. Stephen McDaniel fit that profile, as he lived next door and had direct knowledge of her apartment and routine. His presence in the building during the critical time period placed him within the timeline investigators were reconstructing. This combination of proximity, access, and timing made his account more significant than that of other residents. Investigators also began reviewing his behavior and statements more closely to determine whether they aligned with the known timeline. At the same time, they examined available digital and physical records that could confirm movement, intent, or preparation. This included reviewing activity that might indicate planning rather than a spontaneous event. As this information was analyzed, it provided direction that could not be explained by coincidence or proximity alone. The investigation began to shift from identifying possibilities to examining a specific individual in detail. At that point, the focus was no longer general, but centered on verifying whether his actions matched the evidence being uncovered. This shift provided the basis for obtaining further investigative steps, including a more detailed search. The case had now moved from broad inquiry to targeted investigation. As the investigation progressed, officers obtained and executed a search of Stephen McDaniel's apartment. Inside, they located items that directly connected him to Lauren Giddings' disappearance. These included physical evidence that could not be explained by proximity alone. Investigators also recovered materials that indicated preparation and prior intent rather than a spontaneous act. Digital devices seized from the apartment were examined in detail. Search history and stored files showed that he had researched topics related to concealment and entry before the incident. This activity was time-linked to the period before Lauren was last confirmed inside her apartment. The combination of physical and digital evidence established both access and premeditation. At that point, his position in the case shifted from a nearby individual to the primary suspect. When confronted with this evidence, the investigation no longer relied on inference or assumption. The case now had direct links between the suspect, the victim, and the actions that had taken place. This evidence formed the basis for charges and confirmed that the disappearance had been a deliberate act. Following his arrest, Stephen McDaniel was formally charged in connection with Lauren Giddings' death. The evidence confirmed that he had entered her apartment without permission by using his familiarity with the building rather than forcing entry. Once inside, investigators determined that he carried out the attack in a controlled manner that did not leave obvious signs of struggle. Because he later entered a guilty plea, not every detail was described by him directly in court. However, based on physical evidence, digital records, and the condition of the scene, investigators reconstructed how the incident had occurred. This reconstruction indicated that the act was deliberate and involved prior preparation rather than a sudden event. The absence of disturbance inside the apartment was explained by the method of control used during the attack. Investigators also confirmed that he took steps to conceal what had happened after the crime. This included removing and disposing of the body away from the apartment, which is why initial discovery occurred outside the main scene. The delay in understanding what had happened was directly linked to those actions. Although a single clear motive was not formally stated, the evidence supported a pattern of planning and intent. The case was ultimately resolved through reconstruction of evidence, even where direct explanation was not provided by the offender.